my latest research project is really interested in thinking about what happens when you take a system of already existing rules and governance around land, and you try to formalize it and make it the same across a whole country. So both in Liberia and Sierra Leone, there's a new ongoing process of land reform. And this process of land reform is a little different than some other places where land reform has happened, because it aims to give one standard form of registration, one standard form of governance to represent the already existing customs and practices around land governance, to make it more legible to the state, probably to make it easier for investors to come in and get access to land, and also with the objective of giving communities more formal legal rights to their own land. So I'm really interested in what happens during this process, right? Because there's a difference between saying what you want to happen during formalization and then what actually happens as you undertake this kind of process, because there's all sorts of already existing forms of power, social relations, economic and political interests that are at play. And so it's not a technical measure, right? Granting communities formal rights to their land is not a technical process. It's a really political one, and it is likely to be contested, and it's likely to be contested in different ways for different reasons. So my project is going to look at this process of formalization in Liberia and Sierra Leone. The processes are similar in both countries, but not exactly the same. So for instance, if policymakers are reading this article, what I want from them to take for it is that ideas about what counts for women's economic empowerment should not be limited to these really micro economic initiatives. So oftentimes in post-war settings, women get included in reforms, economic reforms, only in the most bare minimum way, and almost always only in regards to things like increasing microcredit for small businesses. And that's not to say that that's not important, but if you're only thinking about gender and gendered relations of power at a micro level, you're really missing all of the ways in which these relations are going all the way up through the macroeconomic decision-making as well. So policymakers, I would push to think way beyond women's inclusion in microcredit schemes when considering how to include women in post-war economic reform. For scholars, including for students, if I want them to take something from this, it's that it's really important to understand so sometimes I think there's a divide where some feminist scholars focus a lot on discourse and representation, and other feminist scholars focus a lot more on, from an economic perspective, on structural economic matters without thinking about discourse and representation. And when Maria and I, my co-author Maria Martin de Almagro, wrote this, it was coming out of a frustration that these two things matter together. That it's not enough to just talk about how women are represented in international treaties and legislation, and it's also not enough to just talk about the material, structural, economy factors, but that these two things have to be thought of together. Tackle this from a question of feminist thinking, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what is the aim of feminist international relations. So I think a common misperception is that it's about individuals experiencing discrimination. So individuals clearly experience discrimination as the result of gendered relations of power. But this doesn't get at this question of what is what is systemic, right? So it's similar to the debate that happens around questions of race. So if you see race only as individual discrimination, you miss all of the ways that race is really structural. It's embedded in political and economic decisions of exclusion. So I think a lot of feminist scholars joke about feminism being the F word, right? That you can't mention the F word because then it shuts down this conversation. And I think when we think questions of race and gender and class together, we can then begin to see how these are matters of political, social, and economic exclusion that is structural, which means that it is purposeful, right? It's not accidental and it's not about the individual, even though individuals are clearly experiencing the effects of this. In that sense, I think the misconception about feminist IR is that it's about women as individuals, where I would say it's much more about shining light on how gender permeates all of these relations, again, from the household up to international institutions, in ways that exclude both men and women from accessing particular political, economic, social opportunities. I think both in popular perceptions as well as within a lot of academic analysis, there is this idea that if a government doesn't look like it does in Northern Europe or Northern America, that it somehow means that governance is absent, right? So there is this idea of equating governance as an act of decision making, resource distribution, provision of benefits and protections, that if that doesn't happen within the state, that it just doesn't happen at all, right? And so people would then maybe look at places in West Africa and think that governance isn't happening because it's not always happening through the state. And then there would be the perception that any governance that happens outside of the state is just illegitimate, right? And it just needs to be brought into the state. And to me, then this misperception also misses the sort of richness of social life in West Africa, and how creative and innovative people are when it comes to solving everyday problems that I think people in Northern Europe wouldn't be able to solve because we're too reliant on these like really formal, rigid structures of power.